14. When confession is not confession. In a decadent culture, all things are warped and often become a caricature of themselves. For example, comedian George Carlin was quoted recently in defense of some foul-mouthed quote-unquote comedians. Quote, Carlin defends a comic's right to offend. Comedy is a socially acceptable form of hostility and aggression. That is what comics do. Stand the world upside down. End quote. In the past, among other things, comedy has been an affectionate and tolerant view of human foibles, one's own and others. Not so now. Humiliating and putting down others is basic to much current quote-unquote comedy. The decline of biblical standards leads to the exaltation of evil and the legitimization of things previously forbidden. Thus, the Two Live Crew, a rap group, uses lyrics, which Governor Bob Martinez of Florida described as clearly obscene and pornographic. It's brutalizing women. It's bestiality. They're not innuendos, they're raw words, so raw that none of the print media have even reproduced them. There's nothing redeeming about them. The response of Ira Glasser, executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, was notable. Quote, in order to prosecute anything for obscenity, you have to show that it is without any artistic merit and that it appeals to prurient interest as determined by community standards. A record that has sold 1.7 million copies must have some artistic merit, and it seems absurd to suggest that any of this violates community standards when Andrew Dice Clay's albums sell in local record stores. X-rated movies play in area theatres, and Penthouse is available all over the place. If you wanted to arrest people for using this language, you could go to any schoolyard in Broward County. End quote. Without agreeing with him, one must say that Glasser's point is well taken. If, as the Supreme Court holds, the community and not God's law sets the standards, then Glasser has the better argument. Where humanism prevails, all standards are man-made and radically flexible. It's necessary to see this in order to understand what has happened to confession. One work of fiction recently based its plots on a quote-unquote confession. A criminal, knowing that a priest had stumbled on his plan to commit a major crime, confessed to the priest and thereby bound him to silence in order to be free to commit his crime without interference. But is confession without contrition and repentance really confession? Is it not rather in itself a further sin? Is it the will of God that a godly pastor be bound while a sinner continues in his way? This is not all. Some of what passes for confession is a form of boastfulness, of bragging. In the mid-1930s, I knew a girl, a nominal Catholic, who believed in a form of confession while being contemptuous of priests. Being unchaste, she had much to confess, and she relished confessing her inability to resist sexual temptation. When a young priest made a fumbling attempt to entice her, she turned on him with feigned shock that a priest would say such a thing. She then emerged from the church laughing. From my own experience, priests are far more often sinned against than sinning. Confession as a form of bragging is common. To excel in virtue has given way to excelling in vice. Beginning with the Romantic movement, the hero as sinner has become more and more commonplace. Such pseudo-confession requires a human audience, whether of one or of a multitude. Ghetto youth boast of being bad dudes, and young men from affluent homes regard it as offensive to be described as good, polite, or a gentleman. Let us look again at Glasser's statement. For him, quote, artistic merit is determined by the facts that a record has sold 1.7 million copies. Of course, we can say that social merit is determined by the same criterion, If a few million Jews, Chinese, Ukrainian, Cambodians, Armenians, or anyone else are murdered, does the mass scale vindicate the massacres? Does it then have social merit? Is violence done only to the body and not to the mind? If society sets the standards or the boundaries of what is acceptable, no standards or norms are then possible. If the centre of law and society is man, then the changeable will of man ensures that no norm can stand. A humanistic order is thus inescapable disorder. This is why in a humanistic culture we must be wary with respect to confessions. If not followed by a change of life, they are not confessions, but boastings. A good indication of such a false confession is sometimes a prefatory comment. I'll probably shock you by what I'm going to say. The desire to shock is basic to George Carlin's view of comedy. It is also an important factor in false confession. True confession is more than the mere confession of sins. One can hear such confessions everywhere, from bars to airline flights. Valid confession is to God through Christ, whether in private prayer or to a pastor or to a priest. It is to the Lord, because damaged relationship is primarily to God. Changes have taken place in confession from the early church to the present. A central change of concern to us here has been the shift in the consequence of the confession of sin. Thomas J. Bigham has described it as a change to, quote, lenient and precatory instead of severe and penal penances, end quote. The change to, quote, lenient and precatory, end quote, was significant. Precatory means supplicatory. It is an indication that, while the requirements of confession remained, the importance of restitution gave way to the performance of various penitential exercises. Repentance was changed to mean no longer radical redirection of one's life, but a verbal exercise. St. Paul has this to say about repentance. Now I rejoice, not that ye were made sorry, but that ye sorrowed to repentance, for ye were made sorry after a godly manner, that ye might receive damage by us in nothing. For godly sorrow worketh repentance to salvation, not to be repented of, but the sorrow of the world worketh death. For behold, this selfsame thing that ye sorrowed after a godly sort, what carefulness is wrought in you, yea, what clearing of yourselves, yea, what indignation, yea, what fear, yea, what vehement desire, yea, what zeal, yea, what revenge. In all things ye have approved yourselves to be clear in this matter. 2 Corinthians 7, 9-11. Paul contrasts godly sorrow and repentance to ungodly sorrow and ungodly repentance. The difference is that with true repentance, a radical change takes place in a man's life and action. The Corinthian church repented of its sins, punished the evildoers, made amends to Paul, and sought to be clear in this matter. The repentance had substance to it. There is no valid confession where no change occurs.